Welcome to another deep dive. This one is a potential murder mystery. It all takes place on the idyllic island of San Andres, Colombia. The date is October 5th, 2021, an anniversary celebration. It takes a dark turn.
Oh yeah, this case, it really highlights the complexities of human relationships and conflicting narratives,
Yeah,
and the weight of circumstantial evidence.
exactly. We're talking about Maria Mercedes Gnecco, the victim, and her husband, Jose Manuel Gnecco. He becomes the prime suspect right away. The Gnecco family dynamic adds another layer to this whole thing. Strained relationships, accusations flying left and right. It's a lot to unpack. Our main source material is an interview with Jose Manuel Gnecco himself. We're going to be looking for those subtle clues that might help us understand what happened that night.
It's like we're trying to piece together a puzzle. Some of the pieces might be missing or even intentionally misplaced.
Okay, so let's start with the incident itself. Jose Manuel describes a seemingly normal anniversary evening, watching TV with Maria Mercedes. She sees men outside, she gets alarmed. He says he grabs what he calls a traumatic weapon. It's essentially a non-lethal firearm used for self-defense, with the intention of protecting their property.
This detail about the weapon is interesting. It suggests a level of preparedness for potential threats, which is something we might want to revisit later as we examine his background and personality.
Good point. So he goes upstairs. While he's up there, he hears a gunshot, and Maria Mercedes screaming. He finds her on the floor, injured. Now here's where things get a little murky. He calls emergency services, but he doesn't take her to the hospital himself.
That's a decision that has raised a lot of questions. It seems counterintuitive, especially in such a high-stakes situation.
Right, and it doesn't stop there. He takes an indirect route to the hospital, and even stays at home for a bit before joining her there. This is what has really fueled suspicion. Those actions, or rather inactions, immediately after the shooting. It makes you wonder what was going through his mind at the time.
One possibility is shock. Trauma can manifest in unexpected ways. It's possible he was simply frozen, unable to process the situation rationally.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it could be interpreted as an attempt to buy time, to construct a narrative, or even to dispose of evidence.
That's a crucial point. It's all about interpretation at this stage. Now let's move on to the evidence that's been presented in this case, starting with the ballistic analysis. Interpol linked the gun found on some miners later on to the murder weapon. And then there's Gnecco's claim, something he says he learned while in prison, that our former employee, who knew the layout of their house and their finances, was involved in the attack.
This claim introduces an element of premeditation to the narrative, shifting the focus away from a random act of violence and towards a more calculated plot.
Absolutely. Then there's the physical evidence at the scene. Specifically, there's a palm leaf tie on the electric fence, but there's debate about whether it was tied from inside or outside the property. Gnecco maintains it could have been tied from either side.
This seemingly small detail could be significant. If it was tied from the inside, it supports Gnecco's account of intruders entering the property. But if it was tied from the outside, it raises questions about his story and potentially points to staging. This is something investigators would likely scrutinize very carefully.
For sure. And of course, there's the possibility of robbery as a motive, which Gnecco vehemently denies.
It's interesting that he's so quick to dismiss robbery. While it's a common motive, it's not the only one. And his insistence on ruling it out might be telling. It begs the question, what other motive could there be? To answer that, we have to look beyond the surface and delve into the more complex aspects of this case.
Right, like the financial angle.
Yeah.
There are rumors swirling about a large loan Maria Mercedes had taken out. This is where things get interesting.
Gnecco denies any financial benefit from her death, pointing to a concept in Colombian law called benefit of inventory, where heirs are responsible for outstanding debts, to the extent of the deceased's assets. To put it simply, if someone dies with debt, their inheritance is used to pay it off, before any remaining assets are distributed to heirs.
So even if he had a large loan, her death wouldn't necessarily have wiped the slate clean financially for Gnecco.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean finances couldn't have been a factor. Financial stress within a marriage can certainly lead to conflict, and it's something investigators would explore. It's worth noting that Gnecco is adamant that the loan rumors are false.
It definitely adds another layer to consider. Now let's shift gears and talk about Jose Manuel Gnecco himself, his background and his relationships. He's had a somewhat turbulent past, including the suicide of his first wife.
This is a sensitive topic, but it's impossible to ignore given the circumstances. While the death was officially ruled as suicide, there have been accusations, particularly from journalist José Ackerman, that Gnecco was somehow involved. Gnecco vehemently denies this, but the shadow of suspicion remains.
It's a tragic situation, and it's understandable why people might connect it to the current case. Gnecco seems aware of this and makes a point of emphasizing the positive portrayal he receives from Ingrid Polania, his ex-wife at the time of the interview. He wants to dispel any notion of a pattern of violence in his relationships.
It's a strategic move for sure. He's trying to present himself as a victim of circumstance, someone who's been unfairly targeted due to his past.
And he also addresses his supposed connection to the powerful Gnecco political clan in Colombia.
He's very deliberate in emphasizing that it's just a coincidence of surnames, that he has no real ties to that family or their influence. He's essentially saying, don't judge a book by its cover.
He's pushing back against what he perceives as a smear campaign orchestrated by certain media outlets, right?
Exactly. He believes he's being unfairly portrayed, and that public opinion is being swayed against him. It's crucial to remember that we're only hearing his side of the story at this point.
That's a good reminder. So let's move on to another piece of this puzzle, the Gnecco family dynamics. This is where things get really complicated.
The relationship between Gnecco and Maria Mercedes' family is deeply strained. They've been very vocal in their accusations against him, firmly believing he's responsible for her death.
And Gnecco says their lack of support has made it even harder for him to grieve and cope with this whole situation.
He claims it's like he's facing accusations from all sides, the media, the authorities, and now his own family. This is a man who feels very much under siege.
It's a classic he said, she said scenario, with each side painting a very different picture of the events and the people involved.
And it underscores the importance of remaining objective and examining all perspectives, even those that might seem conflicting or biased.
Speaking of conflicting perspectives, let's circle back to that palm leaf tie on the fence. We touched on it earlier. But it's worth revisiting because it really is a crucial piece of evidence. Gnecco insists it could have been tied from either side, which would support his claim of intruders. But the prosecution argues it had to have been tied from the inside, which would point to staging.
It's fascinating how such a seemingly minor detail can become a linchpin in a case like this. The way it's interpreted could sway the entire narrative.
He also denies ever saying the intruders were there to rob them, despite some media reports suggesting that was his initial claim. Now he's alleging they were there to kill Maria Mercedes, potentially hired by someone who wanted her dead.
This shift in his narrative is certainly noteworthy. It adds another layer of complexity to the case and raises questions about the evolution of his story over time.
It does feel like we're peeling back layers of an onion here. He then points to information he received while in prison, claiming a former worker was involved in the attack, and even provided details about Gnecco's habits, like keeping large sums of cash at home.
This claim, if true, introduces a level of inside knowledge that's hard to ignore. It could suggest a more targeted and premeditated attack, which would lend some credence to his denial of robbery as a motive.
He goes even further, saying this alleged accomplice helped plan the attack, and even tampered with the electric fence days before the shooting. He claims he has video footage of the tampered wires, which would be pretty damning evidence if it exists.
If that footage is authentic and can be verified, it would be a significant development in the case. It would suggest premeditation and lend weight to his claims of a conspiracy against him.
And he says he knows the identity of the shooter, and even the person who provided the motorcycle used in the getaway. He claims he learned all this from fellow inmates while he was awaiting trial.
This is where things get particularly tricky. On one hand, it's understandable that someone in his position might glean information from fellow inmates. Prisons are often breeding grounds for rumors and intel. But on the other hand, it raises the question of why he hasn't shared this information with the authorities.
It's a bold claim to make, and it creates a dilemma for anyone trying to make sense of this case. Do you believe him? Do you see him as a victim of circumstance, wrongly accused and targeted by the media? Or is he a masterful manipulator, crafting a narrative to deflect suspicion?
It's crucial to avoid falling into the trap of simply accepting his claims at face value. We have to weigh his statements against the available evidence and consider the potential motives for him to embellish or even fabricate aspects of his story.
It's like we're piecing together a puzzle, where some of the pieces are deliberately misleading. We have to examine each piece carefully, looking for inconsistencies, patterns, and anything that might help us separate truth from fabrication.
And we have to acknowledge that there may not be a neat and tidy solution to this puzzle. The truth might be messy, ambiguous, and ultimately unsatisfying.
So let's try to connect some of these puzzle pieces, considering all the information we have so far. We have this backdrop of suspicion stemming from the suicide of his first wife, which he vehemently denies having any involvement in. Then we have these inconsistencies in his story about the night of the shooting. coupled with the fact that he didn't immediately go to the hospital with Maria Mercedes.
And those inconsistencies are compounded by his evolving narrative. First, it was intruders, possibly there to rob them. Then it shifted to a targeted attack, potentially orchestrated by someone with inside knowledge.
He provides a very detailed account of his actions that night, but are those details meant to illuminate the truth or obscure it? It's almost as if he's trying to preempt any questions or doubts by providing an overly elaborate explanation.
And then there's the issue of the ballistic evidence linking the murder weapon to those miners. He claims to know who the real shooter is, but that information seems to have come from dubious sources within the prison system.
It's a lot to take in, and it's hard to reconcile all these conflicting pieces of information. It's no wonder this case has captivated public attention and fueled so much speculation.
It's a case that challenges us to think critically, to question assumptions, and to resist the urge to jump to conclusions. It really is a fascinating case study in how narratives can shift and evolve, especially when you have a suspect who's as articulate and media-savvy as José Manuel Gnecco.
Right, and it becomes even more complex when you factor in the emotional weight of this case. You have Maria Mercedes' family, desperately seeking justice for her death, convinced of Gnecco's guilt. Then you have Gnecco himself, proclaiming his innocence, portraying himself as a victim of circumstance.
It's a situation where emotions run high.
Hmm.
It's easy to get swept up in the competing narratives. That's why it's so important to step back and analyze the facts objectively, without letting emotions cloud our judgment.
And speaking of facts, let's address the elephant in the room, the trial. Despite the ballistic evidence, linking the murder weapon to those miners, and despite Gnecco's claims of knowing the shooter's identity, he hasn't been convicted. The trial is ongoing, and the question of his guilt or innocence hangs in the balance.
This is a crucial point. The fact that he hasn't been convicted
Yeah.
means that, in the eyes of the law, he's still presumed innocent. We can speculate all we want, but ultimately it's up to the legal system to determine his fate.
So where does that leave us? We have this tangled web of evidence, conflicting testimonies, and a suspect who's both charismatic and controversial. It's like a real-life whodunit with no easy answers.
And that's what makes this case so captivating. It challenges us to think critically, to question assumptions, and to resist the temptation to jump to conclusions. There's no clear-cut villain or hero here, just a complex tapestry of human relationships and motivations.
It's like we've been given a puzzle with missing pieces and asked to solve it. We've examined the evidence, analyzed the testimonies, and explored the various perspectives at play. But some questions still linger.
For me, one of the biggest lingering questions is about Gnecco's claims of knowing the real killer's identity. If he truly has this information, why hasn't it been presented to the authorities in a way that's led to an arrest?
That's a good question. It raises doubts about the credibility of his claims and makes you wonder if he's withholding information for some strategic reason.
Another question that stands out is the role of the former employee. Did this individual actually play a part in the attack? Was Gnecco's portrayal of him accurate? Or was he a convenient scapegoat to deflect blame?
And of course, we can't forget about the palm leaf tie. It might seem like a minor detail, but it has the potential to either corroborate or dismantle Gnecco's entire narrative. If further investigation could definitively determine whether it's tied from the inside or outside, it could be a turning point in the case.
Absolutely. It's often those seemingly insignificant details that hold the key to unlocking the truth. They're the tiny cracks in a carefully constructed facade that can lead to a complete collapse of the narrative.
So after this deep dive into the Gnecco case, we're left with more questions than answers. Is José Manuel Gnecco a cunning manipulator who orchestrated his wife's murder? Or is he a grieving husband falsely accused, caught in a web of unfortunate circumstances?
We've presented the evidence, the testimonies, and the various perspectives as objectively as possible. Now it's up to you to decide what you believe.
We encourage you to continue exploring this case, to research the evidence, and to form your own conclusions. Perhaps there's a detail we've overlooked, a piece of the puzzle that hasn't been revealed yet. But one question remains. Could there be more to this story than meets the eye?
Yeah, it's a case. It really pushes you to think critically and to really dissect the information presented.
It does, and it reminds us that sometimes things aren't always as they appear.
Right. There are always multiple sides to every story. And it's up to us to decide what we believe based on the available evidence.
Speaking of evidence, one thing that stands out to me is the lack of a clear motive. We've discussed a few possibilities: robbery, financial gain, even revenge, but none of them seem to completely fit.
Yeah, the motive. It's a key piece of the puzzle that's still missing. And without it, It's hard to fully understand what happened.
Absolutely. It's like we're trying to solve a mystery without knowing why the crime was committed in the first place.
And that uncertainty, it just adds to the intrigue of this case.
It does. It keeps us guessing and makes us question everything we think we know.
And ultimately, that's what makes true crime so fascinating. It's a glimpse into the darkest corners of human nature. And a reminder that even in paradise, tragedy can strike.
Well said. That's a perfect note to end on. This case, it's a chilling reminder that truth can be elusive and that justice is not always easy to come by. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Gnecco case. We encourage you to continue researching and come to your own conclusions. Could Jose Manuel Gnecco be a cold-blooded killer? Or is he simply a man caught in a web of lies and deceit? The answer may never be fully known.
If you enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into more cases like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like the video if you found the story compelling, and share it with your friends and family who might be interested in true crime and mysteries. By subscribing, you'll stay up to date with all our latest content and join a growing community of curious minds exploring the most fascinating cases. Click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything.